How are you? So, I was never supposed to be a cook. I grew up from a scientific background. My father was a scientist. My grandfather was a scientist. I was supposed to be, aside from a brief period when I was going to be a fireman, which once I discovered that firemen actually put out fires instead of starting them, I changed that. I was going to be a doctor. My mom had it all planned out. I was going to go to Harvard, pre-med. By the time I was 30, I'd be a doctor, and then I'd take care of her for the rest of her life. But you can imagine her disappointment when I didn't get into Harvard, and I was forced to go to a second-tier school instead. So then, in 2002, when I graduated from MIT, I went further down the rabbit hole and became a cook. I worked at restaurants in Boston for many years. And now I've sort of come back into the science of cooking and sort of gone full circle, because the entire time I was cooking in restaurants, I was always really fascinated by the questions of why I'm doing what I'm doing. Why am I cooking chicken this way? Why is the mayonnaise holding together the way it is? Like, why am I frying this food at this temperature? And as a cook in a restaurant, you don't really have time to explore those questions. And cooking is unique because it's definitely a craft. It's something that you have to practice, you have to learn how to do. You have to practice until you're good at it. But it's also a science. And it's unique among the sciences because it's one of the ones that everybody in the world at some point in their life performs experiments in it. And most people do it all the time. Every time you go into the kitchen, you're doing a science experiment. You have chemicals, you have reagents, you're timing things, you're measuring things, you're following procedures, and then at the end, you're eating things and analyzing the results. So it really is a science, but the thing is that most people don't think of it as a science. People still think of it as just a craft, something that is passed down, mother to daughter, or father to son, or cook to sous chef, or Rachel Ray to whoever watches Rachel Ray. And this kind of passed down knowledge can be really paralyzing. So I want to share a little story that I first read in the introduction to Russ Parsons' book, How to Read a French Fry, which is a great book if anyone hasn't read it yet. But the story goes something like this. There's a mother, and she's trying to teach her daughter how to cook a leg of lamb. So they get to the point where they're about to put it in the oven, and the mother says, all right, now you got to take out your saw, and you cut the bone in half. And the daughter's like, well, why do you do that? And she's like, oh, this is the way my mother taught me. I think it makes the meat more tender. So cuts it in half, puts it in the oven. So the next day, the daughter goes to the grandmother, and she says, so grandmother, why do you cut the leg in half before you put it in the oven? She's like, oh, well, that's the way my mother taught me. I think it improves the flavor. So the next day, she goes to the great-grandmother, and she says, why do you cut the leg in half before you put it in the oven? And she's like, oh, you see that tiny stove in the corner? That's the only way I could get it to fit inside. So basically, what you learn from this is that a recipe is really a specific thing that tells you how to take a specific set of ingredients, given a specific set of equipment, and get a specific result. So if I'm starting with a different set of equipment than someone else, and most of the time you are, chances are that your oven doesn't behave the same way as a recipe writer's oven does. So if I'm starting with a different piece of equipment, I'm going to get a different result at the end. And same with the ingredients. Despite the best efforts of the American Cattle Association, every cow is not exactly the same size and same shape. You get different shaped cows. The tenderloin I have one day, 2 weeks later I buy a different tenderloin. It's going to be a couple pounds lighter. It's not going to behave the same way. So a recipe gets you from point A to point B, but what's much more useful than a recipe is to understand the basics behind food science and the theory behind why that goes from point A to point B, because then you can start with any numbers of points A and get to basically any point B you want. So a quick example of this would be if we're cooking, say, something like a lamb chop. So classical technique would tell us that to cook a lamb chop, we get a pan really, really hot, put some oil in it, sear the lamb chop till you get a nice brown crust, put it in a really hot oven until it comes up to the temperature you want it, say 130 degrees for medium rare. Then you pull it out, let it rest, and slice it, and you're done. And what you end up with is something that looks like this. So you can see my aim with the thermometer is not quite perfect, so the very center of the lamb is still at 120 degrees. And then a little bit outside of that, I get a ring of meat that's perfectly cooked, 130 degrees. And then from there, it gets increasingly more overcooked until the outside, I'm left with this gray band of completely overcooked meat. So the question is, why, if this is what you get, why do we do it? And you see, actually, if we go on to the next slide, this is a turkey breast, which basically behaves, most meats behave the same way when you cook them. They cook from the outside in. So on the left side, we have a turkey breast that was cooked at a really high temperature, 400-degree oven, and on the right side, we have turkey breast that was cooked at a low temperature, 200-degree oven. Both of them are cooked to an internal temperature of 160 degrees, but you see that this temperature gradient, the amount of overcooked meat, increases with the higher the heat you have, and that's not really desirable. So why do we do it? And it goes back actually to the 4th or 5th century A.D. With Apicius, the Roman collector of recipes, who put forth a theory that was later sort of confirmed by a German chemist named Justus von Liebig. And the theory was that high heat sears the meat, seals in the juices, right? And at first glance, it sort of makes sense. You cauterize a wound, it stops it from bleeding. So the idea that taking a steak, searing it over very high heat, having that create a liquid-type barrier that'll keep in all the juices, keep the meat nice and moist and tender, the theory makes sense. And for decades, even centuries, that was culinary fact. Everybody did it. From the best restaurants in the world, they cook their meat like that. Even today, many steakhouses cook their meat just like that. The problem is that it's not true. Searing the meat does not seal in juices, and you don't need to look down at a microscopic level. You don't need an electron microscope. You don't even need a scale to know this. All you need to do is take a piece of steak, and I'm sure everybody's done this. All you need to do is take a steak, put it on the grill, get a really nice sear on one side, flip it over, and then a couple minutes later, you're going to see liquid bubbling up through the top, right? So how is that liquid coming through if the meat's been seared, and if the meat is sealed? Obviously, there's something wrong there with that picture. So once you realize that this idea that we've all been following blindly for so many years is not actually true, it really opens up a floodgate of questions. What actually does keep the meat juicy? What do I still need to sear the meat? Is the amount of liquid left inside the meat even what I perceive as juiciness? And it turns out that actually the only thing that matters, for the most part, with how juicy a piece of meat is the final temperature to which you cook it at. So whether I sear it at the beginning or sear it at the end, if I cook a piece of meat to 130 degrees, it's going to have lost about 9% of its liquid. Whether that's beef or lamb or pork. And if I take it to 140 degrees, it'll go up to about 11 or 12%. If I go all the way up to 160 degrees, it'll have lost about 23% of its juices. So really, the only thing that matters is that final temperature. So once you know this, and if you think back to that turkey diagram, once you know this and you follow that turkey diagram to its logical extreme, you realize that the best way to cook a steak is actually to cook it in a medium that is held at the temperature that you want to serve it at the end. So if I have, say, and this is the theory behind, low temperature water bath sous vide cooking that I'm sure you've probably heard about. But if I have a water bath at 130 degrees, I put a piece of steak in a bag, I drop it in there, and 45 minutes later, I'm going to have a piece of steak that's cooked exactly 130 degrees all the way from edge to center. There's no chance that it's ever going to overcook, so I know exactly how much moisture I'm retaining in there. And then all I have to do to serve it is take it out of the bag, sear it to get some of that nice brown flavor and crust development, and it's done. So this is useful for a restaurant cook, someone who has the money to spend on a $1,000 circulator, a machine that keeps the water temperature there, but it's not so useful to a home cook. Even with the home models available now, which are bargain basement price of $450, it's not that useful. But the sort of thinking is that you realize, wait a minute, all I need to do this is something that's going to hold the temperature of water for a long period of time. And I think pretty much everybody in this room has something that already does that. And it's a cooler, right? A beer cooler is designed to keep cold liquids cold. The best ones these days, you can put ice in it, put it in the direct sunlight, 4 days later you'll still have ice in there. So they're remarkably efficient at keeping heat in. But at the same time, they also work the other way around. It also keeps hot liquids hot. So in order to cook a steak, just like they do at fancy restaurants, all you got to do is fill your cooler with 130-degree water. I'm lucky because my tap water comes out at exactly 130 degrees, so this is really stupidly easy for me. Put the meat in a bag, drop it in your cooler, and 45 minutes later, take it out, sear it, and you're done. And the beauty of it is that whether I leave it in there for 45 minutes or 4 hours, there's no chance that it's going to overcook. So I invite dinner guests over. An hour before they get there, I put the meat in the cooler. If they want to eat right when they get there, no problem. I take the meat out. 2 minutes later, serve. If on the other hand, I invite John, who mixes us some fantastic cocktails, and we want to sit there and enjoy our cocktails for 2 hours, doesn't matter. 2 hours after that, I pull the meat out. 2 minutes later, the meat is still perfectly cooked. And you can see that here. These two steaks, one of them was cooked for 45 minutes, and the other one was cooked for 4 hours, and they're identical. So really, this type of thinking applies to all kinds of things. Once you know the basics of how food works, how salt affects meat, how heat affects meat, how emulsifiers affect vinaigrettes, how vinaigrettes cling to salads. Once you know the basics behind those, you don't really need recipes anymore. It frees you from those recipes because now I know I don't want to. If I'm going to cook a steak, I don't have to go and look at a recipe and say, and just trust that 2 or 3 minutes per side is going to give me the medium rare I want. I know that 130 degrees is medium rare, no matter what else I do. So basically, it's a way of freeing yourself from recipes. This type of thinking, and it's something that basically anyone can do, given a little bit of knowledge and an open mind. So in the end, what you get when you stop following recipes is food that becomes a lot more personal and a lot more expressive. It allows you to do whatever you want with your food, and I think that is a really delicious prospect. Thank you.